bucka. Ha. You know the deal.
The next thing we're going to talk about with our number sense unit is called rounding numbers. And the first question you're probably going to ask yourself is, well, why do we need to round numbers? And typically the main reason that we round numbers is for estimating. So when we're dealing with a mathematical question where we don't need an exact value, where we can estimate or have an approximate value. And this is where the method of rounding comes in handy to come up with an estimate. So when we're rounding, there's a few questions we have to ask ourselves. So the first question we want to know is, well, what place are we rounding to? In other words, what place value is it that we're having to round to? The next question we ask ourselves is, well, what two values is our number in between for that place? If you're not quite sure what that means, we're going to take a look at a couple of examples and explore what that means. And then finally, which of these two values is our number closest to? So let's look at a couple of examples to explore these three questions. So for this first example, we're going to round 57 to the nearest 10. So with our first question here, what place are we rounding to, or what place value are we rounding to? We're rounding to the nearest 10. Now, when we look at question number 2 here, it says, what two values is our number in between for that place? Well, here I've drawn a number line, and if we place 57 on that number line, it would be right there. That's where 57 is on the number line, and for the place that we're rounding to, for the tens, this number line is counting in the tens. It's between 50 and 60. So we can see there, when we're counting in tens, 57 falls in between the two values, 50 and 60. And which one is it closest to? Well, if we look at the number line here, 60 is there, and 50 is there, and we can see that 57 is a lot closer to 60. So when we round 57 to the nearest 10, it's between 50 and 60. Those are the two tens that it's closest to, or that it's in between, and it's closer to 60. So since we're moving to the right on the number line here to get to the closest 10, we would say that when we're rounding 57 to the nearest 10, 57 rounds up to 60 because we're moving to the right on the number line. So again, 57 rounded to the nearest 10, we would round up to 60. So here's another example where we're going to use the same number line again because we're rounding to the nearest 10. So there's the answer to our first question. The place value that we're rounding here to is to the nearest tens place. And next we ask ourselves, well, what two values is our number in between for that place? So if we're counting in tens, which this number line is, we can see that 72 would be right there. So 72 is in between 70 and 80. And if we take a look at the number line and ask ourselves, well, which one of these values is it closer to? Is it closer to 70 or is it closer to 80? We can see that it's a lot closer to 70. So in this case, when we round 72 to the nearest 10, because we're moving to the left on the number line, we would say that 72 rounds down to 70. So let's look at one more example, rounding to the nearest 10. So now we're being asked to round 25 to the nearest 10. So again, my number line is counting in tens. First question we're going to ask ourselves is, what place are we rounding to? Well, we're rounding to the nearest 10. and here our number line is counting in tens, and 25 would be right there. So the two values that our number, in this case 25, is in between for the tens, it's in between 20 and 30. And the next question we have to answer is, well, which value is it closer to? Well, if we look at where 25 is in relation to 30 and to 20, we can see it's right in the middle. So it's not actually closer to either one. So this can cause some confusion, and this can cause different answers because it's really not closer. So you could say, well, it's the same distance, so I could round down to 20, or it's just as close as it is to 20 as it is to 30, so I could round up to 30. So mathematicians don't like to get different answers for the same question. So it was decided a long time ago that if a value is right in the middle, we'll always round up. So in this case, we're going to, even though 25 is right in the middle, we're going to round up to the nearest 10, and the nearest 10 going up would be 30. So again, 25 is right in the middle, right between 20 and 30, and so mathematicians just decided if you have a value that's right in the middle, you just always round up to the next place, to the next value for that place. So 25 is in between 20 and 30. It's not closer to either, it's right in the middle. So when it's right in the middle, we round up to the next 10, and going up to the next 10 would be 30. So here's another example. In this case now, the first question we ask ourselves is, what place are we rounding to? Well, now we're being asked to round to the nearest 100. So you'll notice my number line has changed to count in hundreds. And we're rounding 382. If I try to find that on the number line, I would say that would be right about there, more or less. So the two values that it's in between for that place, so for the hundreds, 382 is in between 300 and 400. And what we can see is, well, when we ask ourselves which one is it closer to, we can see 382 is a lot closer to 400 than it is to 300. So we would say that 382 would round up to 400. And we say it rounds up because we're moving to the right on the number line. To get to the closest 100, we have to move to the right, so we're saying 382 rounds up to 400. So we're going to look at one more example here, and again, in this case, the place value that we're rounding to is to the nearest 100. So once again, my number line does count in 100s, and next we ask ourselves, well, what two values is our number in between? So the value that we're looking at here is 952. And if we were going to put 952 on the number line, it would be right about there. So the two values that it's in between is 900 and 1000. So even though 1000 has a value in the thousands place, remember, when we're counting in 100s, eventually we're going to get to 1000. So this is still counting in 100s, going from 900 to 1000. And 952, you probably recognize, is just very slightly closer to 1000. It's almost right in the middle, but because it has that 2 there, 952, it's a little bit closer to 1000 than it is to 900. So we would say we'd round up to 1000 because we're moving to the right on the number line. So to finish off our lesson on rounding numbers, I'm going to ask you to answer each one of these 3 questions for these 10 questions here. So the first question is really already answered for you. For each one, it tells you which place you're going to round to. But for each question, express or write down which two values is our number in between for that place. So, for example, with question number 1, we know we're rounding to the nearest 10. So that's what we're rounding to there. So what two values is our number in between for that place? So in other words, for counting in tens, what two values is 67 in between? Well, hopefully by now you recognize that 67 is in between 60 and 70. And then finally, which one of these values is it closest to? So 67, is it closer to 70 or is it closer to 60? I'm not going to answer that for you, but that's what you would write next. So answer these 3 questions for each one of these. And if you're able to do that, congratulations, you now have a firm understanding of how to round numbers.